So yeah, as mentioned, you are muted at the moment, but there will be time for questions at the end. If any of the panelists want some questions during, or Eleanor and Yaz, just let us know and I can read those questions out. So yeah, you can submit questions in the chat function, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. They will go directly to me, so I'll just save them all. And if you have any technical issues, just let me know. I work for Arts SU. My name is Lulu and my pronouns are she, they. So you can just contact me in the little chat box and I'll help you as much as possible. Obviously, we want this to be a nice space, so just treat everyone with respect and dignity. There's no abusive language, discrimination or harassment of any kind that will result in being removed from the event. You will notice that we have live captions happening. So just to be aware that this isn't perfect and it can make errors, but hopefully today it will pick up the dialogue effectively. And we, just also be conscious that some people have family members around them and under 18s with them. So just conscious of like language around young people. And yeah, if there is any sensitive topics covered today, all the facilitators know to use trigger warnings. So you'll have a bit of like time just to move away from your screen, like feel free just to walk away and come back whenever you feel comfortable. And I think that's all the admin stuff. So yeah, if anyone joins, I'll just talk to them privately in the chat, but I'll hand over to Eleanor and Yaz to introduce themselves and the panelists as well. And yeah, it's going to be exciting. So enjoy.
Okay, I guess I'll go first. Hi guys, thanks for coming today. My name is Yasmin and my pronouns are she, her. I am your campaigns officer if you're a UAL student. If not, I am the campaigns officer for 2021 and I graduated from Camberwell College of Arts. Yeah, I'll pass on to Eleanor.
Hi, I'm Eleanor. I use she or they pronouns and I am the activities officer or your activities officer at Arts Students Union. And I graduated from Camberwell College of Arts in 2019. We'll pass over to our panelists if they would like to introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'll go first. I'm so Eleanor, or Ellie, it's probably a bit easier. And I use she, her pronouns. And I work at Shape Arts, which is a disability-led arts organisation, and we work to remove barriers to creative excellence for disabled and marginalised artists. I'm a white woman with short brown hair wearing a pink shirt as well.
Okay, hi everyone, I'm Chris. My pronoun is he, him. I'm a Black disabled artist that makes work about disability politics. I'm wearing a green hoodie today. Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Abby Palmer. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a white woman. I'm 32 and you can't really see what I'm wearing, but it's dungarees and a yellow top. I am a disabled artist and writer whose work explores the experience of the disabled body and the queer body, I guess, and what it means to be navigating the type of institutions that those types of bodies are forced to occupy.
Amazing, thank you everyone. Eleanor and Yaz, do you want to start off with the questions?
Yeah, I was muted. It was bound to happen. But yeah, thank you guys so much for introducing yourselves. So to begin with, we're kind of gonna, talk about the structure of accessibility and what does disability mean and what does it encompass. It'd be good if you guys could like share that with us and share your kind of experience and point of view. I don't know if anyone wants to go first.
I feel like that's like Ellie's like
yeah, I guess so. From the Shape perspective as an organisation, we work from the social model of disability, which I think we might kind of come on to in a minute. But basically, I guess I'll explain it now because it kind of answers the question. the social model of disability is kind of in contrast to the mainstream medical model of disability, which I think most people are familiar with because you hear it when you're growing up, and it's what everyone kind of is taught to believe as a kid, that disability is a personal problem. It's like something to do with an individual's own impairment. Whereas the social model, the social model of disability basically holds that the problems aren't individual, it's a structural situation causing structural issues that people face, creating barriers. So an individual person isn't disabled because of a medical impairment, but because society is structured in such a way that they're prevented from being able to do things. So the problem is basically society, and it's not the individual. And I suppose from that kind of working definition, which is, in my opinion, fairly malleable anyway, SHAPE consider anybody who self-identifies as disabled to be disabled. If somebody believes they face barriers because of this kind of structural obstacle and system that we're within, and they self-identify as disabled, then that's kind of where we take it from. If somebody wants to say they're disabled and believe it, then that's kind of as much as we need. But there's quite a interesting, I guess, conversation at the minute happening about neurodiversity, and I know there are a lot of neurodiverse people who don't self-identify as disabled, and equally there are a lot of neurodiverse people who do identify as disabled, and neurodiversity kind of encompasses quite a lot of different things, including autism and ADHD. So yeah, it's quite broad basically, but we really are led by self-identification. So there isn't, in the way that a lot of medical model structures would ask you to kind of prove your impairment, prove that you're struggling, and prove that you suffer. That's not how the social model works. So that's not what we would do. But
I guess there's also, like, I've seen a lot of pushback from certain communities who have fatigue-based impairments as well, who argue that in some ways, like the social model, that there is some debate about whether it goes far enough. For instance, the idea that society, it's an interesting debate that I have a lot of feelings about, which is, I guess, if you are if you are unable to get out of bed or need to sleep more hours than other human beings, it ceases to be a structural problem, and no amount of structural change would alter that.
yeah,
That's a complicated area, because there are things structurally that could be done to make your life better. I would say, obviously, the social model is a really good start, like from my perspective.
yeah,
I think I kind of echo what both Ellie and Abir said. I think it's constantly evolving, which is a good thing. I think that's a good space to be in. But again, yeah, it's not really much for me to say, because, as I've said, basically what I would have said. So it encompasses a broad spectrum and affects people differently. So yeah.
yeah. I think as well, one of the things that I find useful about understanding disability through the social model is it puts it in relationship, maybe not perfectly, but it puts it in relationship with other kinds of marginalizations, for want of a better way of explaining that. I think it paves quite a good path towards more intersectional approaches to kind of social justice. And I think within the arts, that's quite useful, specifically because the arts is kind of a structure in and of itself. And I think stepping back and having that perspective on something like disability allows you to kind of carry that across to thinking through and about other things and how to make other changes.
Yeah, definitely. Structure, I feel like for me as an artist, I don't know if I'm jumping ahead in our plan, but like structure, this understanding the structural limitations of and understanding my place within that, like the privilege I have as well as the shortcomings, it has helped me understand things like, for instance, why I can't afford a studio when people who can climb stairs or get into a studio might be able to, or why my search for I do have a studio at the moment, but why it took me so long and why I don't get to use it as much, and why it costs more, and not having that knowledge as a structural problem rather than it being my fault has been helpful, but it's also been helpful on a structural level for me to go, okay, well, in which case, how could I possibly level the playing field a little bit? Where can I ask for support for that? So that's kind of a project that's happening at the moment, which is helpful. So I think the social model and things like that, where you go, okay, the system is making this a little bit more difficult for me, and anything that encompasses that is helpful to my mind.
Yeah, I think for me, I've kind of been constantly engaging with the model unknowingly, growing up, and I think it wasn't until I started to use an electric wheelchair that I realized actually there are so many other more barriers in place to keep me kind of keep people kind of segregated. I think one thing came to mind, like I'm just reading my notes, is which was quite eye-opening for me, is when I applied for university. I got into nearly all the universities I applied for, but I couldn't use their spaces. I couldn't use student accommodation. I was like, okay, so this is the reality. But I think again, it's about for me, it's about kind of challenging, like all of it. I think challenging those expectations, or the expectations I put on myself or society, and having these type of conversations, which are really useful in raising awareness and pushing the social model forward.
Yeah, I think that obviously there's a difference, I think, between being an artist and working specifically at Shape, because I have to kind of spend every day talking to people being like, this is what to do. So like my perspective from this is very from the position of someone whose job it is to kind of think through the structures and try and suggest changes to people. So I spend a lot of my time like having video calls with people, and they're like, how can I make this thing accessible? What can I do about my team? What can I do about this building? All of this kind of stuff. So for me, I think the social model is very, very pragmatic to that kind of end, because it's kind of my roadmap for doing work. But I think that it is interesting how much things are changing, and like because I do the social media as well, so I spend every day kind of like scrolling through loads and loads of tweets and seeing what people are talking about, and it's really, I think it's quite exciting, because I think that there is probably it hasn't gotten to this point for a good reason, but I think after the last year there is a bit more of an attention on disability and accessibility. Like the amount of inquiries that we're getting from people has just like massively increased, of people that want to make their work accessible, even like completely unrelated to COVID, kind of like working from home stuff. But I think obviously people have been working digitally a lot more. It's been talked about a bit more. So I think that there is a bit more attention being paid, although obviously the reason we're all here having this conversation is because there are problems that persist despite spending every day doing this. So yeah, and I think it's interesting because I think that the very kind of, this is a bit reductionist on what we do, but I think the end goal of something like Shape is that Shape is no longer really necessary, because we're basically an advice service. We do other stuff as well. We do other fun stuff, and we have heritage projects and stuff like that, which are all really valuable kind of independently. But as a kind of service provider, we're providing advice for people that don't know, because I think there's a real information distribution issue when it comes to accessibility, but also I guess a lot of different things, but people just don't know. And the answer to so many questions when it comes to access is so straightforward. Obviously there's a lot of stuff that isn't, but to most things the answer is incredibly straightforward, and people are always so surprised by that. People just don't know. And I think that part of that is people aren't familiar with the social model. They don't understand disability in the way that a lot of disabled people do, and they probably think that it's not as like in their life. People that don't kind of identify as disabled, or know people who identify as disabled, or kind of put the effort into finding out, I think that that medical model is so pervasive and so powerful that it really does, it shuts something off for a lot of people where you think it's something that you'll never see. And I think that's become more evident this year as well. But and then the other part of it is that the arts, maybe particularly, I don't know, all things are very inaccessible at the minute, but has this kind of romanticization of struggle. There's a lot of archaic spaces physically and kind of mentally and attitudinally. And it's kind of like people enjoy that side of the arts. And so that kind of creates a problem in and of itself, because it's one thing to want to kind of make a space accessible, but some spaces people kind of almost covet because they're so inaccessible, and it's just a bit odd. But so that's one of the problems I think the arts faces specifically.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sorry, carry on.
I was just going to ask the other panelists. I feel like we've covered a lot already. So I guess for me, like how do we examine ableism within the creative sectors? And I know you've touched on this a little bit already, but like how can we start to address some of the sector specific problems that we have, like the romanticization of struggle, like you mentioned? I feel like, as like an artist myself, I find the creative sector very inaccessible, and there's a lot of things that are in our sector that are not good. So
I don't know. I think for me, it's it may sound a bit silly, but I think it's quite obvious. And what needs to be done, I think conversations like this, organizations, independent businesses, and people need to be talking to places like Shape, Disability Online, where they have these resources at hand to answer those questions. Would be a good and important starting point. Yeah, because it's a minefield. It's a minefield, and it's always changing. For instance, a lot of disabled people are scared to apply for funding for the fear of losing their benefits. But that in itself, the government's always moving the goalposts. So they say you can apply for one thing, but actually, if you do now, it's going to affect you. It took me a little over 2 years to figure out a way how to get around that. But that's constantly changing. So I think having conversations with places like Shape, Unlimited, Disability Online, and engaging.
I would agree with all of that, and also add that it would be something that has been a constant fight between me and, for instance, the Arts Council, is that at the moment, the model is very much that you, as the individual applying for funding, have to do the work to find out what accessibility is, what it means, what the perimeters are, and have budgeted for all of that before you get your grant, which means you're doing it for free, or asking someone like Shape to advise you for free, and have no clue what the extent of accessibility requirements are, how much certain things cost, for instance, and why then they're necessary. So just for comparison's sake, I used to supplement my income as a disabled artist with access consultancy for people who'd just got Arts Council funding to run an event. They'd already been given the money and would say, okay, we've got, say, £500 to make this event accessible, but they'd already booked it into a building that you couldn't get into, and that's not enough to pay for a BSL translator and anything else for 2 days of event, you know. So I've been having, every now and then late at night, I send insane emails to Shape Arts. I don't know, Ellie, if you've got one of these yet, but where I'm like, why don't the Arts Council pay you to consult and help people before they get their money? And I've also had that kind of conversation with Arts Council where I've said, why do you not support people in understanding what type of materials that are available? That Shape have really good written advice, but why does the Arts Council not point harder to that when people are going through applying? Because you end up with what I've seen happen over and over again in disabled arts and disabled literature is a disabled artist then ends up getting funding and hopes to kind of fix everything with their one project, burns themselves out, because really you need assistance to both make disabled art and make an accessible event. People all go, oh, isn't that wonderful, and then go about their business. And I find that a very frustrating. I no longer do access consultancy because it was too triggering to have to walk into a room and beg to be acknowledged. And I'm one of the more, I don't know how to put it, but my access needs are easy to communicate in the grand scheme of things, and that makes, and to have to beg for that and beg for beyond that and explain why no one has enough budget to even listen. Nobody reads those emails, and that can be very frustrating. I feel like at this point I should say we will be touching on triggering information here about the experience of being a disabled artist.
Yeah, and I think that kind of harks to one of the big ableism things that I've kind of experienced and seen stuff in the arts, is that there is this kind of, it goes back to that information distribution thing. I think one of the reasons it's so hard, they make it so hard, the structure is, it is so hard to find the right information and to have access to it, which is another level of accessibility, is that there's like a tendency to assume or expect a certain type of art from disabled people, especially if those disabled people are vocal about being disabled and about having their access requirements met. Like, I think that a lot of people in the kind of traditional art space think that if you kind of come to the table and you say, I'm disabled, these are my access needs, you're about to make some kind of work like incredibly specifically about a very specific understanding of disability, which is obviously not the case. It literally, like, people can make whatever their art they want. Like, it's not really relevant whether or not they're disabled, that's just like them. But I think that there is, you know, from an organizational perspective, we experience that just the amount of conversations we have that don't go anywhere, or the difficulty of kind of getting kind of mainstream, like we can be paid to consult and train mainstream institutions and organizations, but God forbid they like take our artists. You know, it's quite hard for us to convince them that their expectations are completely wrong. And I think that's something that I've kind of come up against, is what people just have a very specific idea of what it is to be disabled, to look disabled, to, you know, whatever. And that really filters through everything, and it becomes present in the arts, because I think the arts, like any work that's deals with identity, is already kind of either looked down upon or put in a box by a lot of people, or, you know, there is an expectation if you're making art and you're not a kind of cis white privileged person, because those are the people that get to do art that isn't really about themselves. Everybody else is expected to make art about themselves, which is then simultaneously ridiculed because it's about themselves. So it's a bit of a catch-22. And I think that that's one of the kind of main things that I guess we're trying to kind of subvert in terms of ableist barriers. I mean, obviously there's like so many individual things relating to specific experiences and specific access needs. Like you said, Abby, like the way that the order of events when it comes to funding is problematic as it stands, as is kind of, I guess, the competitive undercurrent of a lot of funding at the minute, because it just doesn't really lend itself to anyone. I'm not sure anyone enjoys that, even people who are disabled. So and I think there's a lot of stuff to do with how funding applications work, how they're written, what time you have, where the information is, and transparency and things like that. Lots of kind of specific bits of ableism.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you for that. Yeah, so just wondering if we could like explore a bit more around kind of accessible spaces and kind of looking at how the pandemic has changed the arts and kind of changed the spaces that we find ourselves in. Just gonna leave that there. Who I'm sure you all have lots to say about it.
Well, for me, I feel like it's been like a fascinatingly bittersweet experience. Like that, suddenly things that were perceived as incredibly alien and less than, for instance, a Zoom panel rather than face-to-face talks, are suddenly a given. You know, I had to quit my degree because it was inaccessible, and I was begging to be allowed to be within my own support network in a space that would have allowed me to practice better and work better. And that the university I went to said, no, you have to physically be here, and now none of their students are there. So there's like, in some ways it's more accessible than ever in some ways, and yet it has taken 6 to 9 months for people to work out how to transcribe on Zoom, how to transcribe events. I saw in the literature community and the art community a lot of a sense of online shows or online book launches being compensatory and not good enough, and the understanding that these are all fillers until we can get back to normal life, in inverted commas. And so in some ways we've seen the capacity to imagine and make things much greater and more exciting and innovative, and yet a lot of the able community, I was incredibly disappointed by especially the first six to 9 months of the pandemic, where people were sort of going, well, I'm just not going to try as hard because this isn't a real event, and I'm going to let my disappointment over physical space being inaccessible eclipse my audience's experience of what is still a valid space. And I found that fascinating.
Yeah, I think for me, I'm a bit suspicious. Like it feels at the moment. Well, I'm hoping it's not. Basically, I think it might be a fad.
Yes.
How long will it last? What's going to happen after? Now, for me, the proof is in the pudding. Basically, people talk up a good storm, but let's see what it's like afterwards. Like, obviously, accessibility is a hot topic right now, and everyone is kind of enjoying it. But again, like Abby just said, I think we'll see what will happen when things start to open up. Is it going to be relevant still? Like this space for me feels familiar. Like many other disabled people are isolated and segregated. This is nothing new. It's kind of like the bubble has burst for everyone else. So yeah,
Yeah.
I'm a bit suspicious in that sense, but I think it's a good thing. I think a lot of positive things have come out of there, online stuff and different organizations thinking about how to structure their business now and so on. But talk is cheap right now. We will see. We will see.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's interested me has been how art has moved online, and like watching all of these kind of, I mean, not just more traditional, like a lot of people who've been paying to kind of create virtual spaces to display artwork.
Mhm.
And the virtual spaces look exactly the same as the physical spaces. And I just think, you know, it probably is, there's probably that undercurrent of suspicion as well. I think you've had the opportunity to completely kind of disregard the white cube and all the problems that everyone kind of knows. I feel like that's such an over discussed thing at this point. Like all of the problems that people feel with traditional gallery setups could have been ignored for the last year. Like that we might have to return to them. That might be the case. People might give up on this kind of energy, but we didn't have to have them this year. That was kind of the point of being at home, but I've seen a lot of them still. And I guess the other thing that I think is interesting is, again, I guess relating to this, like, will this last question, is it's interesting to me that all of these kind of more accessible practices have been put into place, and that's obviously great, and it has really, really benefited so many people that I work with. Like I've had so many conversations where people have said, oh, this is brilliant, like I never have to like come to London for work again and travel and do all of this, and it's really, really, really changed a lot of things for people for the better, and hopefully that does last. But there are some things that haven't been done that I just think would have been a great vibe for everybody, and would have made working and life more accessible, like giving people more time off that's paid in the last year, giving like the pay from the government, everybody could have got some money from the government, like allowing people to, expecting people to exist in the same way they did before this year, throughout this year, has obviously had a disproportionate effect on disabled people. But I just think, yeah, it's funny what has and hasn't been taken up, and I'll be interested, like Abby and Chris, to see what lasts.
It's also like something fascinating to me that's happening is every major gallery, every institution that has funding has suddenly, they're all at the same time, when they're like, I think Arts Council must have done like put out a grant that was like, these are our priorities, and on the same week there were 9 million calls that were like, we're looking for someone to either address the pandemic or not address the pandemic, who's underrepresented in every single tick box fashion that's possible. You can say whatever you want, but all of our forms are ever so slightly different and quite hard and inaccessible. You have 1 week to do it, and sorry, we can't give you any feedback because so many people applied and nothing's actually happened. And basically all the work has dried up except for the work talking about being a disabled artist, which is like a really bittersweet hole again to be in. Like my brother and I are both artists, and we've both got bookings. This isn't a dig on this situation at all, but it's fascinating. He's abled, I'm not. Our practices are really similar. He got a booking from Central St. Martin's to do a talk about his practice as a cis white man living in Rotterdam. They could finally book him because it's accessible. And I got called the same week to do a talk about my marginalization in this lovely space, which I love. I love to be here, but it's fascinating, you know, the types of calls and the types of boxes you get to fill. And I think that for disabled artists coming into that as new practitioners, it's it's kind of this fascinating double-edged sword where you can't necessarily pretend your disability isn't there, because it's not possible, and it's important to talk about these things. But then and theoretically there's all this funding available when it's a trend, as Chris said, or fad where it's suddenly they're putting these call outs, but actually the call outs themselves are inaccessible. What the underlying work is often not being done, and that is interesting to me, just interesting.
Yeah. I think that, I just saying, I'm just reminded of being the token disabled artist at uni or work or whatever. Now I think it's quite funny. I'm like, give me the work. I can tick the boxes for you. This is what I do. But still, it's like you said, it's a double-edged sword. But to begin with, I think I didn't want to create anything related to pandemic being locked down. I saw it quite early. I'm like, what is this? But yeah. I was just about to swear. Just like,
I feel like the way I've navigated as an artist, the way I've navigated that sort of sense of feeling like a token, and again, like quite a palatable token, in like it's quite a disgusting space to be in sometimes, is to charge diversity tax if you realize the moment you feel tokenized, I double my fee now, and that really works because either it pay if you know you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're experiencing ableism in a way that could be triggering or painful, but you can't afford to not take the work or want to do the work because it might be interesting still. It might be a great exhibition opportunity. I just double my fee, and then that pays for my therapy. Yeah. And sometimes I name it as well, so I put it in as diversity tax because essentially organizations need you as well. Yeah, if someone's really insert swear worded me off, I just it got, I don't know, but the confidence to do that came from actually having, for instance, Shape a few years ago, and I together had a big fight with a major institution who were trying to book us but not pay for it in a really fascinating way, and it was such an exhausting argument for everyone, and I was really lucky to have representation, but also to have been given opportunities by an organization like Shape to begin with, that allowed me to build my confidence and profile as a practitioner. And I think that actually, I guess what I'm trying to say is there are other organizations that are doing that too, but one thing the arts can be doing is investing in their artists. You know, if without making them do too much work to begin with, by beginning to have those conversations and saying, we support you, what do you need? It's just frustrating that so that the labor isn't on the individual disabled artist to do, like what Chris is describing with navigating how you manage your benefits and things and things like that. All of how do you navigate funding, how do you navigate your practice, all of these things are intrusions on our artistic practice, because every time we are spending a day administrating, explaining to an organization or to the DWP or why our needs are valid, we're not making art. And that is a very frustrating space to be in, I guess. I'm sorry, sometimes I go on for too long, but I feel like while I'm on this tangent, so in my practice, the way I developed this idea a few years ago, that was kind of it's called Intrusion Theory, and the idea is basically that if, as a disabled person, we are constantly facing these intrusions to our creative headspace, like I guess the classic idea of like a creative, an artist or a writer is that you write every day or paint every day or do something every single day, and it's very capitalistic and all-encompassing in a way that isn't accessible to many people, regardless of how they identify. If we're being intruded by constant hospital appointments or carers coming in and out, or like even just the physical thing of moving down a road and getting to a curb drop that we can't get down because it's not, there's no space, that those moments are taking us out of our like creative reverie, and we're not thinking about our practice, we're thinking about literally moving backwards and sideways and around to get where we want to go. And my argument has been that artists who face that kind of intrusion, rather than pretend they're not there and wonder why we're kind of 10 steps behind our peers, is to use those intrusions as kind of a jumping off point. So for me, that has meant making work that's much more multi-sensory, or making work that where my audience do 50% of, instead of me doing everything with my hands, which are very painful, I invite my audience to do half of the work for me and say that that's an engaging game. But it's just finding ways to play with the fact that these intrusions are here, and if we identify what they are and acknowledge them, we can use them as a jumping off point from which to make innovative and different work. And but in order to do that, I needed funding. So I don't know, it's a complicated, that was a lot of thoughts all at once.
Just to touch on what Abby said, I think for me, that's been quite key. I realized that a lot of my time was taken up by trying to navigate these barriers. So for me, I knew that I needed people to help me support, to write, to move stuff around in the studio. I needed someone to help me write applications who knew about that. I needed a way to access the funding without affecting my benefits. Those key things were put in place so I could have the creative space to make work. But it's still a lot of work. But I think, I think for me, I kind of identify what you just said because of those reasons. And yeah, it's definitely helped. But again, it's I'm aware that the playing field is not level. So before I even left university, I was thinking of what I need to do in order to survive as an artist, and what that meant. There was no accessible studios. I have, but I kind of pushed around, and then someone wanted to make accessible spaces, so I'm a token disabled artist in a studio, which is not a bad thing for me. But yeah, I think these conversations are brilliant for those who are not aware of it all, who can change the reality.
Yeah, I think that so much of accessibility and like access work and committing to that is about this kind of transparency, and it's only through being transparent that you kind of identify barriers. And obviously those barriers can be, so there are some kind of unifying barriers that people face, but more often than not they are just completely, like, disabled people aren't a monolith, they are so individual quite often, and like sometimes it might require you doing a bit of research to make sure you fully understand the kind of funding situation or whatever. But I think that transparency is basically the bottom line of accessibility, because if there's no shame and kind of tension when disabled people kind of talk to institutions and galleries and funders about their needs, and also when institutions and galleries and funders say, hang on a minute, we don't know exactly what we're doing, what is it you need, let's have a conversation about it. Like, it's so bizarre, I guess, what you were saying earlier, Chris, when you were like, oh, it's funny because it just seems so obvious. Like, it is just like obviously there's more to it than a conversation, but it starts with a conversation, and that's where a relationship can build from. Like, I think that people are worried, people are very scared. I guess a lot of the people that we speak to at Shape when we're giving out advice and we're like doing consultancy work are kind of like, what do we say, what language do we use, how do we do this, and how do we caption something? And I'm like, well, it's pretty straightforward, really. Like, there's a really straightforward, easy answer to this, and it normally starts with just talking to the people that you're working with, finding out what needs they have, check in with the people that you're showing the work to, find out what's going on with them. Also, because people's needs change. Like, just because you're working with someone who's disabled and they tell you their needs kind of a few years ago doesn't mean that it's necessarily going to be the same 5 years later. And I think that a commitment to accessibility is fundamentally a commitment to transparency and honesty. And I think that really stretches across a lot of different things as well. I think beyond disability, like, if you are just honest and transparent with people, you'll normally be okay. And things that people are scared about, like getting it right, that almost isn't really, I don't know, in my experience, that kind of, I don't know, awkwardness that some people feel, it just completely vanishes when you sit in a room and you realize we're just both having a conversation here and we're both interested in the work that this person's making, so let's just bash out the details, work out how we're going to do it. Like, it's that kind of mundane, but it feels like, I mean, obviously because all of these structures are in place to make us believe it isn't, it feels so much more dramatic, but like at its height, it is just a mundane chat.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think that's fundamentally at the core. I think having that conversation, I know it may seem awkward or whatever. It's like, for instance, it's like, I know this might not be a good analogy or metaphor, but I think I would rather children would ask you, and I'd rather someone just asks, don't presume or whatever, and we're all different. But this kind of conditioned way of thinking is, and I don't blame no one, because like I said in the beginning, I wasn't always as restricted by my impairment or disability. I wasn't aware of certain things, and I know that people are not going to be aware. So I don't blame institutions to a degree, but people are not stupid. So, like Ellie said, transparency and honesty is the way forward, I think.
Yeah, that conditioned fear is fascinating, isn't it? Like when parents will sort of tell their child off in a way that the fear becomes of the thing that they're looking at. Like they want to know why something's different, and the parents are so afraid of creating a fence that they train their children to just not look anymore. And I think we've been trained our whole lives to just not look at this, and I think like so often when you're doing these kinds of conversations with institutions where they haven't encountered marginalization in its many forms, they use terms like fully accessible, and the big like devil's advocate question is always like, but can you ever, what if I include all of these access needs, what if they contradict with these access needs? And there's no such thing as fully accessible. There's only frankness, and this is what we can do and this is what we can't do, and being perfect like, I don't understand why these big institutions are desperate to be perfect when they're so fundamentally flawed in really basic ways. It would be much better to admit that we're all, I think one of the problems we have is also about pedestals. Like we put these institutions, we're in this weird space at the moment where there's a lot of work being done in a lot of groups. There's a lot of calling out, there's a lot of attacking, and there's needful calling in and raising awareness, all happening at once. But the moment you place an institution on a pedestal and say that they are beyond criticism, it makes it very hard to have those small, frank conversations. And we all make compromises in order to meet the expectations of spaces that are afraid to have conversations with us in a way, I guess.
Thank you all for that. That was a lot of personal experiences that you shared with us, and I'm really thankful that you've taken the time today to kind of talk to us about those things. I guess with you've covered most of our questions actually. So me and Yaz actually didn't have that much work to do. So thank you for that. I just kind of wanted to close before we open it out to questions from students. I think we've talked a lot about kind of how we want to change institutions in the world, but I thought it might be useful to kind of call in and talk about any advice that you would give to disabled practitioners about anything you like, really, just something maybe that you wish that you knew when you were starting your career. If that would be okay, if you don't feel comfortable doing that, we'll just open up to questions.
So I feel like I'm going to say something quite meaningful. I don't know. I think the unknown. I think it's just quite the unknown. Can be quite scary. But I would say is there are resources and information out there that will enable you to have a practice, and you can have a meaningful practice and develop as an artist. It may not be, I don't know, it may not, basically think big, I think. Just think big and not belittle yourself. That's the main thing. Yeah.
I would agree with that, and specifically in that type of thinking, when you think about what's holding you back, I think the government, the last however many years of austerity, have done such a good job of making us think we don't deserve anything. Think about what it is that, imagine what it would mean. How can you have a functioning art practice that enables you to make the best art and focus on what only you in the world could possibly do? And then you think about what those barriers are. And one specific area I'm going to talk about, and funding and things will change in the next few years. But currently, Arts Council, if you put in a grant application, for instance, the personal access costs section is outside of the rest of funding, and they don't ask you specific questions about what it is. If basically the question is, would you be able to make the art at the quality you needed to without this thing? And I think that's a really good question to be asking yourself in all of, if you need a massage to recover from the pain of physically sticking things together, that is a valid thing to ask for. It seems indulgent because we're told we don't deserve anything, but if that's what it means, if that's how you're going to have a sustainable practice, budget for that in your funding applications, budget for that when people are commissioning you, and tell them what that costs, and have a sense of what those costs are. Sometimes it can be overwhelming and scary, because then you think, well, what happens when that money disappears? But we have to all be communicating the true cost of being a disabled body as well as a artist. Those costs are valid. And look for the spaces that might fund it. You have to be audacious, like have the audacity of like a white man whose parents sent him to private school.
Yeah, I guess my only advice, not having my own artistic practice from the kind of shape side of things, is to echo. I think being audacious and thinking big are great advice for anybody. I think that make use of people like Shape, make use of me, it's my job. Like, be audacious in your emails to me, like that is what I'm there to help do, and so is the people that I work with. And kind of more practically, things like an access rider, so that you kind of, I find my access rider quite useful at work, which if you don't know, you can Google it, there's loads of free templates. Yeah, basically like lining out your access needs. And I think that, yeah, my best advice is basically to make best use as you can of those resources, because also I think that from an organizational perspective, like, although obviously there's lots to do and there's lots of work to be done, and people are slow, as we've established, to making those changes, there is change happening. Like that Arts Council thing, like the social model isn't mainstream in the UK, but it is pretty mainstream in the arts, or it's increasingly so. And I think that though it's not perfect, though there's lots to do, it's definitely getting better, I think. And I think that in a way that maybe people couldn't before, if you hold somebody to account now, I feel like you might be more likely to see a bit of change, or at least kind of some compensation. And I think that having that confidence to hold people to account is something that's really, really valuable. And if you can kind of build that up with, you know, whatever networks you're in, your friends, people like Shape, building up that confidence to put yourself first and hold other people to account, make space for yourself, like Abby said, then I think that's really the best you can do.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being involved in our panel. Those are some great sentiments to kind of close that section, especially being as audacious as, was it a white man? Yeah. Something that I'll be taking forward from today. From either students or staff who are involved in this panel, now is the time to ask questions. Lulu says in the chat, you can unmute yourself, or if you want to put your message in chat, we'd be happy to read it out. Make use of this opportunity. Ask a question if you want to.
I'm going to just flag that if you don't want to ask a question now, you can message Shape on Twitter, you can email us if you have any like questions or anything comes to you. Unlike Abby and Chris, who have a lot of other more important things to be doing with their time, I will reply to those emails because that's what I sit at my desk doing. So if you don't want to ask it here, you can always email.
Yeah, I'll just say, yeah, message Shape.
Hi, everyone. I wanted to ask a question, if that's all right.
Yeah.
First of all, thanks for a great talk. And this might be a bit private, so I don't expect everyone to be comfortable to answer, but at what point and how did you actually manage to take back control over your disability identity rather than, you know, being scared to talk about it, or obviously the society is very ableist still, that there's a lot of disadvantages with even sharing that you're disabled. So how did you kind of manage, and at what point were you comfortable with reclaiming that identity back?
Crystal, I'll let you go first.
I'll try to be quicker.
Take your time.
I think I know what I'm trying to say. So I think for me, for a long time, I was kind of in denial of the fact that I was disabled or being associated with actually being disabled or grouped in that group. It wasn't until I went to university and I saw how much I was pushed into a box. And I thought, I've had to fight before. This is not new. I thought, you know what, this is what I want to do. And kind of an event happened where I kind of became homeless while I was in university. That was a turning point. Then I started to make work that was talking about disability politics. And then from that point on, it's given me extreme amount of confidence to be honest and open and not ashamed. That comes with a sense of power and control, in not just in my practice, but in my personal life, and taking ownership over how I want my care to be given to me. And yeah, so yeah, if that makes sense.
For me, I mean, that makes perfect sense. And yeah, I think a similar thing, I guess, for me, there came a point where the effort of concealing my disability was more exhausting and performative than the effort of disclosing it. And actually, in some ways, it was a huge relief at the point where it was no longer possible. It was no longer possible to conceal it. It was a big breath of fresh air. I was terrified when I started using, for instance, an electric wheelchair, that you can't just park outside a cafe and sneak in around the back and hope that your client doesn't know that you're disabled. That breath of, and I've kind of fluctuated in and out of different mobility aids, but the learning from it was the energy that I was spending pretending it wasn't a problem was preventing me from working. And so I would say the comfort of having a disabled identity, in my experience, isn't something that is ever neutral or constant. It fluctuates like my body does, and like my mental health does, and like all of our identities do. There are times when it's harder and times when it's easier. I think knowing that there's a community of, especially of good disabled artists, also made a big difference. Challenging some of my own internalized ableism about what disabled arts could be, was engaging with disabled arts and going, wow, this is good, I want to be like that, was a big turning point for me also. Yeah, so finding your tribe.
Yeah, I think for me, like, it kind of goes back to what Chris was saying. I think finding, because I don't think I like encountered the social model until I was at uni, and I think I'd spent a really long time being really, really angry with everyone. And like, I was like, why is it so hard? Why is like my life so much harder than everyone else's? Which is obviously part of the problem for me. But and then like suddenly I was hearing these people talk so like powerfully about being disabled and about kind of the structures, and it suddenly just kind of clicked in my head, and I was like, oh, like it's not really about me, it's about other people, and it's about structures and society. And I think it was that for me, that where I was able to kind of turn that anger into understanding, through the kind of wealth of thinking and theory and knowledge that has come before me in terms of disability politics and disability justice. Like, I think that the work has really been put in by so many people before us, and I think that once I kind of started connecting with that was it for me.
I hope it's okay if I share as well, as like a disabled person. But I only started kind of defining myself as disabled in 2019. and I've had like medical issues like all my life, but like I really think there is a stigma around like diagnoses and like navigating like medical models of disability, when actually I just need people to understand like, this is what I need. I don't owe you an explanation about what's happening with my body. You just need to accept that this is who I am. And actually like being able to be like, I'm disabled, having a word that just let people know that like, I need you to work a bit harder if you want to work with me, basically. And yeah, because sort of coming out of 2019, I started my job at the Students' Union, where I've been doing a lot of lobbying, especially around like step-free access. And actually I had to unlearn a lot of ableism as I was doing this work as well. So it was really kind of complicated position for me to be in, because I was learning so much about myself and about a community that I had only recently kind of identified with, even if I had identified with it a bit in the past. So yeah, I hope that was okay to share. I think using labels is like, it's about setting boundaries, I think, and about what's comfortable for you. Is that okay? I hope I haven't said anything. We're all still learning, I think.
But I think it's such a good point that I think if you are non-marginalized, let's say, the expectation is you never have to negotiate your what it is to be you in the world, and for everyone else, and the more you intersect in other ways, the more you are expected to explain yourself. And I think it's about being aware of that, and being aware that the system also is the discomfort of having those conversations can be in part because we are presented with a system that isn't used to having conversation. For me, it's fascinating like how easy it is to slip from one identity into suddenly the world of queerness suddenly feeling much more accessible and beautiful and important, because you find yourself aligning with negotiations of space and questioning everything. Everything becomes a question, and that's a beautiful thing, and it ebbs and flows like everything else. But finding ways to negotiate being you in the world and the language you use, that's a constant changing question, because we're constant changing people.
I guess it's like coming out, like for me as well. Like it was like, oh yeah, now I use a stick and I'm queer.
Yeah.
So it's like just deal with it.
But I think it's like a really important thing to kind of acknowledge as well, the fact that we have all had to learn about ourselves and how to kind of use those labels and navigate that ourselves. So when institutions are kind of too afraid to navigate it, it's like, we had to unlearn exactly what you're going to have to unlearn, and you're allowed to make mistakes and you're allowed to be wrong, but it is the transparency. And that's something that me and Eleanor are constantly trying to talk about with the university, is that transparency and admitting you're not the expert in the room goes a lot further than just ignoring it or doing something really subpar with the assumptions that you know what you're doing. But yeah I guess, does anyone else have any questions they want to ask the panel?
I haven't had any in the chat, but if anyone wants to unmute themselves, or if you want to write one in the chat now, go ahead. I am conscious of time, just to bear in mind, because we have a second half of the session. I want to make sure everyone has a good break and sort of a breather. But if we overrun a bit, we can always start the session a little bit later if people are happy. But just, yeah. No more questions?
Slight awkward silence while we wait. how long?
Okay.
Yeah, was this meant to run for? Is this
You're bang on time, guys. Literally.
time?
Quarter to 15-minute break.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, guys. Thank you to Lulu for helping us facilitate it. Yeah.
Cool. Thanks
Eleanor,
for
do you
having
wanna? My brain's gone blank, so I'm gonna let you take over.
Thank you guys for coming. It's amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And thank you to all the attendees. This has been recorded, so I'm sure it will be available again and we can share it out. But thank you, everyone. I think if you stay on the call, if you're doing the later session, but feel free to take a 15-minute break and then we'll come back at 4. Is that right? Are we on the same call, Eleanor?
I assume so.
Yeah, it's the
let's do that.
same link
Let's
if
do
you
that.
do leave and want to come back. And yeah, thank you, guys.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
joining us. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for your time. This was lovely. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully stay in contact.
Yeah, for sure.
Amazing.
Bye bye bye.